For roughly 6,500 years, people have been pulling copper out of one island in Lake Superior. On the island the Ojibwe call Minong, there are pits cut straight down into the bedrock, and some of them were opened before the builders at Giza had laid a single stone. None of that is a legend. A man named William H. Holmes wrote it up for the journal American Anthropologist in 1901, and the National Park Service will tell you the same thing today. The copper country of Lake Superior holds some of the oldest metal mines anywhere on Earth. Here's the part the familiar story gets backwards. When prospectors came ashore in the 1840s and were sure they'd discovered something, they hadn't. They were the last people to find that copper, not the first. The Ojibwe had known about Minong for longer than most nations on the map have existed, and they had said things about that island, and about that copper, long before any mining company ever drew it on a chart. So this is what the Ojibwe knew about Isle Royale before the miners came. It's what the island was to them, what they did there, and what the record says they believed about the metal buried in it. And it's the story of what happened when the newcomers arrived and decided the place belonged to them. I went back to the people who wrote it down, to Holmes, to a park superintendent named Cochrane, to a French missionary who kept notes in the 1600s, because most of this is not a mystery. It's a record, and it has been sitting there the whole time, waiting for someone to actually read it. Let me start with the pits, because the pits are where the whole thing stops being a story and turns into stone you can put your hand on. When the first American copper prospectors climbed over Isle Royale in the 1840s, they kept finding holes. Shallow trenches and rounded pits, sometimes cut several feet down into solid rock, scattered along the copper-bearing ridges of the island. Some were half filled with rubble and standing rainwater. Some had full-grown trees rising straight out of them, old trees, the kind that take a couple of centuries just to reach that size, which meant the pit underneath them was older still. And here and there, down in the bottom, the prospectors found tools. Rounded beach stones, heavy in the hand, hammered flat and broken on one face from long use. In some places there were thousands of them, lying right where they'd been set down and never picked back up. Those prospectors thought they'd stumbled onto a secret. What they had actually done was walk into somebody else's workplace, a workplace that had been running since a time beyond anyone's reckoning, ages before their own grandfathers were born. Holmes, the man I mentioned, came through toward the end of that century to study the pits properly, and what he described is not the work of some vanished race of geniuses. It is the patient, skilled, and frankly staggering labor of native people working copper the hard way, generation after generation after generation. Here is how they did it, and the method itself is a measure of how long they'd been at it. They built fires against the rock face to heat it. Then they threw water over the hot stone, and the sudden shock cracked it. Then they went at the cracked rock with those handstones, the hammerstones, pounding the softer rock away until the copper stood up out of the surface. Then they worked the copper free and hammered it cold into the shape they wanted. No smelting, no forge, no furnace of any kind, just fire, water, stone, and time, and a knowledge of the metal so old that its beginning is past the edge of anyone's memory. The copper here helped them in one respect. It comes out of that ground as pure native metal, sometimes in single masses so large the sheer size of them became a legend of its own, and pure copper can be hammered cold and never once melted. But knowing that, and building an entire craft on it across 6,000 years, is not a small thing. A single good pit could stand for the effort of many people over many seasons, and there are hundreds of pits on Isle Royale alone. Across the wider Lake Superior copper country, more than 1,000 of them have been located and mapped, and the copper did not stay on the island. This is the detail that widened the whole thing out for me. The metal these people worked out of Minong, and the mainland pits traveled. Hammered into tools and beads and ornaments, Lake Superior copper moved along trade routes that ran clear across the continent, and pieces of it have turned up in the ground as far away as New England, hundreds and hundreds of miles from the lake it came from. Long before any European set foot here, the copper of this island was already famous, already moving from hand to hand across half of North America. The people who dug these pits were not isolated. They were the source of something the whole continent wanted. And think about what they made from it. Not weapons of war, for the most part, but the tools of a life. Arrowheads and fishhooks, knives and awls and sewing needles, bracelets and beads and ornaments worn on the body, Practical, everyday things. And beautiful ones too. All of it hammered cold from metal that came out of the ground already pure. 6,000 years of that, on an island in the coldest of the Great Lakes, long before anyone on another continent had so much as heard the word America. I want to be careful right here, because this is the exact spot where a good true story gets hijacked by a bad fake one. You will hear people say the ancient minds prove some lost advanced civilization was here, some superior vanished race that got wiped out and forgotten and whose secret we've lost. That is not what the record shows, and it is not what the Ojibwe say, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of a spookier video. The tools are North American tools. The workmanship matches native metalwork found all around the Great Lakes. The people who dug those pits did not vanish. Their descendants were standing right there on the shoreline when the prospectors arrived, and their descendants are here now. The only thing that ever truly vanished was the newcomers' willingness to believe that native people had done something this old, this large, and this difficult, entirely on their own. And the age of it is not a guess, either. Beyond the pits and the tools, there is a second and completely separate line of evidence, and I find it one of the most convincing things in this whole account. A team of geologists, led by a scientist named David Pompiani, went out to a quiet inlet on Isle Royale called Macargo Cove and pulled up long cores of mud from the bottom of the lake. Lake bottom mud stacks up in fine layers, year after year, like the pages of a book, and it traps a chemical record of what was happening on the shore around it. When people mine and pound and work copper, they release faint traces of lead into the water, and that lead drifts down and settles into the mud in its proper layer. When those geologists read the layers, they found the chemical fingerprint of copper working, going back between 5,400 and 6,500 years. The pits told one story. The mud, read on its own by people who never touched the pits, told the very same story. That is about as solid as ancient history is ever going to get for you. There is one more turn to the pits before I leave them, and it is a bitter one. Those ancient workings did not just sit there as curiosities. The 19th century mining companies used them as a map. The old pits marked, better than any survey could, exactly where the richest copper ran, because the ancient miners had already found the best of it and gone straight for it, so the newcomers followed the holes. On Isle Royale, the company that dug there in the 1870s even took the island's own Ojibwe name for its operation. They called it the Minong mine, and they sank it right where the ancient pits already were, guided by the labor of the very people they were displacing. And when Holmes and the Smithsonian gathered the evidence of that ancient mining and put it on display at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, millions of visitors filed past it. The proof was never hidden. It was in a journal, and it was in a World's Fair, in front of the whole country. What went missing was not the record, it was the respect. So hold on to that number, because everything else in this story rests on it. People were mining Minong 6,000 years ago and more. That part is stone, it's datable, and nobody has to take my word or anyone's word for it. What comes next lives in a different kind of record, and I am going to mark the line clearly every single time we cross it. Because the island was never only a mine. To the people who went there, it had a name, and the name tells you what it was to them. They called it Minong. The best guide I found to that name is a book by Timothy Cochran, who runs the Grand Portage National Monument on the Minnesota shore and worked hand in hand with the Grand Portage Ojibwe to write it. He titled the book Minong, The Good Place, because that is the sense the name carries. The good place. A good place to be. A good place to go and get what you needed. And when you look at what the Ojibwe actually did there, you understand exactly why a people would call an island that. They did not live on Minong the year round. It sits far out in the coldest of the Great Lakes, and the crossing to it is genuinely dangerous. Open water in a birch bark canoe, with the weather of Lake Superior able to turn on you inside an hour. Getting there at all was a feat, and getting there and back was a thing you earned. What they did was travel out in season, paddling from the mainland, from what is now the Ontario and Minnesota shore, and the island paid them back for the risk of the trip. There were blueberries to pick, whole slopes of them going blue in late summer. There was a rich, fat, oily lake trout the people prized above the others, called siskiwit, running thick in the cold water around the island. There were caribou to hunt on the island itself, in the days when woodland caribou still ranged that far south, before they were gone from that country for good. There were beaver and bear. There were maples to tap for sugar in the spring. And underneath all of it there was the copper. The same copper their ancestors had been drawing out of the rock for thousands of years. Think about what that actually means. This was not a barren rock they occasionally raided for metal. It was a larder, a hunting ground, a fishery, a gathering place, and a mine. All of it at once, woven into the seasonal round of a people who knew that lake better than anyone else alive. Cochrane goes through the old paper, the fur trade accounts, the mission diaries, the Hudson's Bay Company post reports, and what he finds running through all of it is a steady, quiet, unbroken presence. Families going out to the same fishing spots their grandparents had used. When a company called the American Fur Company set up commercial fishing stations on Isle Royale in the 1830s, they did not discover new fishing grounds. They sat their stations down right on top of the old Ojibwe ones, because the Ojibwe already knew, and had always known, where the fish were. And when that company's fishing venture collapsed around 1841, native families simply moved back onto those same sites and went on using them, the way their people always had. That is the thing. The single word Minong holds that no mining chart ever could. The company men saw a deposit, a set of coordinates with money in the ground under them, and that was the whole of it to them. What the Ojibwe had was something else, a relationship so old that no one could point to the start of it. It ran deeper than ownership, and it ran in both directions, people and place bound together across a span of time that makes the entire American presence on that lake look like one short afternoon. Cochrane's book is, in part, the account of how that presence was worn down and pushed off across the last third of the 1800s, as the mining and the treaties and the sheer weight of newcomers slowly cut the Ojibwe off from an island they had used since before recorded time. But that is the end of the story. First, there is the other thing the record keeps, the thing the fur trade ledgers could never touch. It is about the copper itself, and what the Ojibwe understood it to be. And here is where we cross the line I promised to mark. Because the record does not only tell us the Ojibwe went to Minong for copper, it tells us how they felt about that copper, and that is a different kind of knowledge. You cannot pull it out of lake mud. It comes from what people said, and from the men who happened to write it down. Go back to the 1600s, to the very first Europeans who ever reached that far western lake. They were French Jesuit missionaries, and one of them, a priest named Claude Dablon, kept careful accounts of what he saw and what he was told. Those accounts survive in an enormous printed collection called the Jesuit Relations, and they are some of the earliest written records of the Lake Superior Ojibwe that exist anywhere. Dablon helped found the mission out at the western end of the lake, which put him closer to this copper country, and to the people who knew it, than almost any other European of his century. And he and the priests with him were fascinated by the copper. They had heard the stories of shining metal you could pick up loose along certain shores, of lumps and masses of pure copper that the local people plainly treated as something more than ordinary rock. And the Jesuits noticed something about that treatment that clearly puzzled them. The Ojibwe were careful with the copper, respectful of it in a way that went well past its simple usefulness as a material. Now let me be exact about what this record is, because being exact about it is the whole point of this video. It is a 17th century missionary writing down what native people told him. So it is oral tradition, caught and pressed onto a page through a stranger's hand and a stranger's language. What it preserves is roughly this. The copper of the lake was watched over. There was a power tied to the deep water and to the metal in it, a being the Ojibwe knew and the Frenchman did not. In the wider tradition of that country, this power of the water is often pictured as a great lynx or panther that lives beneath the lake, a spirit being, not a beast anyone ever claimed to have hunted and killed, and not, let me say this as plainly as I can, anything from the sky or from another world. A spirit being, in the ordinary way that many peoples across the earth have a spirit bound to a certain mountain or a certain river. And the copper of the lake was, in a real sense, in its keeping. Dablon set down a story that carried the lesson of it. Some men, the account goes, once carried a quantity of copper away from one of the islands where it was found, and afterward misfortune came down on them. What the story taught was that you did not simply help yourself to that metal. You came to it with care, with respect, perhaps with an offering, understanding that the copper was not ownerless, and that it was not free for the taking. By the time the Jesuits were writing it down, taking copper carelessly from the wrong place was treated as close to forbidden. Not because of any law that a council had passed, but because of what the people understood the copper, and the lake it came from, to be. There is a second thing the record quietly shows, and it fits the very same shape. The French did not only admire that copper, they wanted it, or at the least they wanted to know exactly where it came from, because a source of pure metal like that was worth a fortune to a king. And the people were slow to tell them. Again and again the accounts note the Ojibwe holding back, reluctant to lead outsiders straight to the copper, careful about what they showed and to whom. Whether that caution was reverence, or plain good sense about what strangers tended to do with a thing of value, or both at the same time, it was real, and it too got written down. I am not asking you to believe in a lynx beneath the water. I am asking you to notice the two completely different ways of seeing one green metal. To the people who had worked it for 6,000 years, copper was a gift that arrived carrying obligations, something you handled with care because it was watched over, and because it mattered. And that idea, that the metal in that ground was not simply there for whoever showed up with a shovel, is the exact thing the next arrivals could not understand and would not honor. If you're new here and enjoying this kind of historical depth, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because a very different kind of record was about to be written about Minong, not in lake mud, and not in a mission diary. On paper, in ink, in the cold, flat language of treaties. By the 1840s, the copper of Lake Superior was no longer a native secret or a Jesuit curiosity. It was a rush, a full stampede. In fact, it was the first great mineral rush in the country's history, years before anyone struck gold in California and set the whole nation running west. Prospectors and speculators and mining agents poured up onto the Lake Superior shore, chasing copper, staking claims, filing for permits, throwing up rough little boomtowns on ground that had been quiet Ojibwe country a single season before. Word had spread that the southern shore of the lake and the islands scattered in it held copper in quantities that could make ordinary men rich, and the United States government wanted clean, clear title to every bit of it. The way you got clear title in that era was through a treaty. So in the autumn of 1842, at a place called La Pointe, on the Wisconsin shore, agents of the United States sat down with the bands of the Lake Superior and Mississippi Ojibwe and produced the document that history remembers, bluntly and accurately, as the Copper Treaty. On paper, the Ojibwe ceded an immense stretch of country, the copper lands along the lake, and Isle Royale along with them. In exchange came the usual things, the annuity payments doled out over years, the goods, the promises, the assurances that the people could remain for the time being on the land they had just signed away. And here I have to give you a detail that shows just how little the men drawing that map understood the place they were drawing. The one band of Ojibwe who knew Minong best, who used the island the most, the Grand Portage people up on the far northwestern shore, were not even a party to the 1842 treaty. They had been left out of it entirely. The border between the United States and British Canada, out in that corner, had only just been fixed that same year, and the news traveled slowly, and the Grand Portage people believed in good faith that they, and their island, sat on the British side of the line. They thought Minong was in Canada. They thought that it, and the copper inside it, was simply not the Americans to take, because it was not on American ground at all. They were wrong about where the border had landed, as it turned out. And so 2 years later, in 1844, back again at La Pointe, the Grand Portage Band signed a second agreement, an addition tacked onto the first, that formally pulled Isle Royale into the cession. Now the paperwork was complete. On the strength of ink signed in part by people who had genuinely believed the island belonged to another country, Minong became American ground, surveyed and thrown open for private claims. I should say plainly that the Ojibwe did not simply sign themselves out of existence in these treaties. The bands kept the right to hunt and fish and gather on the very lands they ceded, the ordinary work of living off that country, and that right was not a small footnote. Native people have carried it all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States in our own time, and stood on the words of these old treaties, and won. But the island itself, as property, as a thing a company could stake out and tear open, had changed hands with the scratch of a pen, and the men holding the pen were in a hurry. And that is the moment Minong, the good place, became a copper claim. That is when the boats began arriving carrying men who had no idea what a Siskiwit was, who had never once picked a blueberry on those slopes, who looked at the ancient pits and saw nothing in them but proof that there was metal down there worth digging. The relationship that reached back 6,000 years, and the deal signed on a single afternoon, were about to meet each other on the ground. And that meeting has a human face, a real one, with a name and a date attached to it. Her name was Angelique. I want to slow all the way down and tell you her story carefully, because it is the truest and the hardest thing in this entire account, and because it very nearly did not survive to be told at all. Angelique was an Ojibwe woman, young, still in her teens by the account that comes down to us, though the record is not perfectly certain of her age. She was married to a man named Charlie Mott, a voyageur, a traveler of the fur trade routes. The two of them lived at La Pointe, the same settlement where those very treaties had been signed. In the summer of 1845, right in the heat of the copper rush, a man named Cyrus Mendenhall, working for an outfit called the Lake Superior Copper Company, hired the pair of them for a job out on Isle Royale. Angelique knew that island, and by the account she was the one who had located a large mass of pure copper somewhere on it. The company wanted someone to stay out on the site and guard that find until a boat could come and haul the copper off. Charlie and Angelique took the work. It was work, in a hungry season, and they took it. And here is the thing to understand about that decision. On its face, it was a perfectly reasonable job. Watch over a spot on an island you already know well, through the back half of one summer, and get paid for it, with a boat due back long before the weather ever turned. People up and down that lake took work exactly like it in those years. The trap was never in the job itself. The trap was in a single broken promise, and in a company that treated the two human beings it had set down on that island as an afterthought it could afford to forget about. Mendenhall carried them out to the island on his schooner, a vessel called the Algonquin, and put the two of them ashore on the 1st of July. The promise was a simple one. A boat would come back for them in no more than 3 months, well ahead of winter, bringing more supplies and collecting the copper. And to carry them through those few weeks, the couple was left with exactly what the record takes the trouble to list. Half a barrel of flour, 6 pounds of butter, some beans. That was the whole of it. A few weeks of thin food for 2 grown people, on the firm understanding that the resupply boat was already as good as on its way. The boat did not come in 3 months. The boat did not come at all. Whether the company forgot them, or ran short of money, or simply decided that 2 people on a rock did not rank very high on anyone's list, no one ever came back for Charlie and Angelique that season. The summer ended. The blueberries that might have carried them were finished for the year. In a hard fall storm, the couple lost their canoe, and losing the canoe meant losing the ability to leave the island or to fish the open water off it. Their net was destroyed. And then the winter came down over Isle Royale, which is one of the coldest and most cut-off places in the whole interior of the continent, and the two of them were alone out on it with very nearly nothing left. What happened across that winter is genuinely hard to sit with. The food gave out. Real hunger set in, the deep kind, the kind that starts to take a person apart from the inside. The account that survives tells us that Charlie began to come undone as he starved, that his mind broke under it, that in his worst hours he frightened her badly. And then his body failed him, and he died, and Angelique was left alone on the island in the dead of a Lake Superior winter, with her husband's body and no way at all to get off it. She did not lie down and die beside him. This is the part of it I keep turning over in my head. Alone, starving, grieving, in the worst cold that country can produce, she kept herself alive by nothing but her own knowledge and her own will. She ate what a winter island would grudgingly give her: poplar bark, bitter frozen berries she could still scavenge. And she needed to trap food, and she had no net and no fishing line left, so she made her own snares. She pulled long strands of her own hair, and she braided them into cords strong enough to hold weight, and she set those snares for rabbits along the runs in the snow, and she caught them. That is a large part of how one young woman lived through the coldest, darkest months a human being can face. She stayed alive on the knowledge of that country that her own people had been carrying for more generations than anyone could name. The same deep familiarity with Minong that had once made it the good place, turned now to the single raw purpose of not dying on it. When spring at last came back around, and a boat at last returned to the island, they found her alive. She had outlasted a winter that had killed her husband, on an island she had been left on to guard another man's lump of copper. Sit with the arithmetic of that for a second. A company left two living human beings out on a rock in Lake Superior to protect a piece of metal, gave its word to come back for them, did not, and as a direct result one of them starved to death and the other survived only by eating bark and by snaring rabbits with cords braided out of her own hair. That is the human cost of the rush, delivered whole in a single story, with a single name on it. A young Ojibwe woman named Angelique lived every hour of it, and lived through it. She went on to live for decades afterward, out at Sault Ste. Marie, and she died there an old woman in 1874. And I want to stop on the plain fact that we even have her name, because Angelique is the exception, not the rule. The copper rush marooned people, worked people, and used people up all along that shore, and the overwhelming majority of them left behind no trace that anyone can read today. No name, no account, no trace at all. We know Angelique's story because of one strange accident, which I'll come to in a moment, but standing behind her, unnamed and unrecorded, are all the others the paper trail simply lost. When the record names no one, and across this whole history it mostly names no one, that silence is not proof that nothing happened out there. It is a measure of how much got forgotten. But her story, the thing you just heard, hangs by a thread so thin that it should genuinely frighten anyone who cares whether the past gets remembered at all. Here is how close we came to never knowing one word of it. Angelique told her own story, in her own words, years after that winter had passed. And that account was written down exactly once and set into print in a place that almost no one would ever think to look. It appears as a footnote in the first printing of a book published in 1907, a biography of a Lake Superior businessman named Peter White, written by a man named Ralph D. Williams. Down at the bottom of a page, in small type, tucked inside a book about somebody else entirely, Angelique's account of her winter on Isle Royale was put into print in her own voice. And then it was very nearly wiped out. When that biography went back to the presses for its later printings, the footnotes were trimmed down, and hers was one of the ones that got cut. If you pick up a later edition of that same book today, her story simply is not in it. The only reason the world still has Angelique Mott's own account of what happened to her on Minong is that a single early printing of one obscure biography preserved a footnote that the next printing threw straight in the bin. And I will say it plainly, it is nearly a miracle that the account survives at all. And that is the thing I keep coming back to, the real reason I wanted to walk you through all of this in the first place. We tend to think of the past as something solid, something that is simply back there behind us, fixed and safe and waiting. It is not. It is held up by a scatter of pits that happen not to get filled in, by lake mud that happened to get read by the right people, by a missionary who happened to write down what he was told in a language he barely understood, by a footnote that happened to survive one printing before it was cut out of the next. The Ojibwe knew Minong for 6,000 years, and almost none of that knowledge was ever going to be written down at all, because it never needed to be. It was carried inside people. It was passed hand to hand and mouth to ear, in a language and a way of living that the copper rush and the treaties and everything that came marching in after them did their level best to break apart. So when I tell you this is what the Ojibwe knew about Isle Royale before the miners came, I mean it as something recovered, dug back out of the ground and off the discarded page, not as something obvious that was lying on the surface for anyone. The mines are real, and they are provably ancient, older than the pyramids. The name Minong, the good place, is real, and it means just exactly what it sounds like it means. The way the Ojibwe understood that copper, as something watched over, something you did not take lightly, is real, and it was written down by the very first outsiders who ever laid eyes on the place. And Angelique is real, right down to the strands of hair she braided into snares, handed to us across more than a century, by nothing but an accident of publishing. And none of it is only in the past tense, and that is the part I most want to leave in your hands. The Ojibwe did not vanish from Minong, whatever the treaties were built to do. For a long stretch of the last century, the island's Ojibwe history was barely told to the visitors who came out to the park at all, as though the place had no story before the miners, and the Grand Portage people had to push, and keep pushing, to be written back into the record of their own island. And they have been. Isle Royale, together with its whole scattered archipelago of more than 400 surrounding islands and the waters around them, has now been recognized as a traditional cultural property tied to the Grand Portage Ojibwe, the same band that once believed the island lay on the British side of the line. And today, at that park, the flag of the Grand Portage Band flies alongside the flag of the United States. The people who named the island the Good Place are back in the record of it, and this time they are there openly, as full partners in telling the world what the place actually is. The pits are still out there on the ridges, filling slowly with pine needles and rainwater, exactly as Holmes found them. The copper is still in the ground. The caribou are gone from the island now, hunted and crowded out, and that is its own kind of quiet loss. But the people who knew the caribou are not gone. And Minong is still, by its oldest and its truest name, the Good Place, held by a people who knew it and loved it for thousands of years before anyone ever came to take it from them, and who know it and hold it still. Before we close, if these old stories and the people who first wrote them down are what you came for, the final boss tier at $9.99 gets you members-only videos plus your name in upcoming uploads. Boss tier at $4.99 for early access. Link in the description. Thanks for watching to the end. Next time, we'll follow that same copper off the island and into the hands of the people who carried it across half a continent in trade, and we'll read the warning the Ojibwe left about the lake itself, in a record that almost no one has ever bothered to open.